Okay, this is Bad Science 101. There are a few topics I want to go over. Just want to sort of dump what's on my brain, sort of what I've been thinking about. Things that have been sort of, I guess I've been mulling over in preparation for the big debate on skepticism versus Christianity. Um, and just I've been accused of being a bit bellicose and argumentative, and I just want to put some of these points out here because I'm not sure if we're going to have a debate, but if we do, I just want to put them out here. So this is what I'm calling Bad Science 101. This topic is Darwinism. Let's talk about Darwinism. Now, I think that one of the main tenets of Christianity is share your light with people. If you got truth, you mention it, right? And that's academic freedom. I think that if you believe something, you have a right to sort of explain what it is you believe and let people know why and whatever the case may be. And one of the things I've noticed is that within the scientific community, that's becoming less and less likely. I think what was maybe at one time a discourse on scientific understanding and reasoning and ideas has become a bit of a polemic from one side of the fence. Or maybe not from one side of the fence. I mean, there's two sides, but I think they're yelling at each other without any sort of reasoned debate. One of the things that terrified me this year was watching the movie Prometheus. I don't think a lot of people cared too much about it, but just as someone who has faith in Jesus Christ, I look around me and I see the evidence for a personal God, and I say that okay, I believe this. And to me, it's a genuine faith. It's something that informs the way that I live my life, and what I believe and how I interact with the world, and what I feel about people around me, and et cetera, et cetera. And I guess watching this movie, the real sort of cultural baggage that went along with Prometheus was this idea that you have scientists or you have people that engage in thought, and their faith is it's a spiritism. I mean, it's completely devoid of reason. They can engage in scientific endeavor and maintain a faith that is intellectually contradictory to what they believe at the core of their being, but they can do so because they've made the divide between, well, science has answered all the questions, and we have absolute faith in that, but we have these emotions and spiritism and sort of this idea of some sort of inner force, and we're happy with that. I'm oversimplifying the argument, but the picture I saw in that movie was we have science on one side, and the only way to have a reasoned faith is to have a faith that is devoid of reason. And I think that's sort of the picture that a lot of young people, I don't know if it's something that I notice demographically being on the bottom half of the planet, or if it's something that's changed in the last 10 years. Coming from another academic institution, I'm now at the University of Auckland. Coming from another academic institution, one of the things that I found is that people definitely had viewpoints about cosmology, biogenesis, origins, but they were always willing to listen to other sides of the story. If someone had a reasoned discourse, they were willing to engage that. And I guess one of the things that I find in Auckland, as opposed to Canada, which is where I'm from, is that nobody's willing to have that discourse. So it's a lot more difficult to really engage these questions of Genesis, these questions of origin. I mean, we're all creationists. We either believe that it was done through amalgamation of mutations, or it was done by a creator God, or whatever other option you have. But we can't discuss those modes without stepping on people's toes, and it's too bad because people are interested. Looking at the Pew Forum statistics out of the United States, it was found that 64% of Americans support teaching creationism alongside evolution. 63% of Americans also believe that there was some sort of divine or guided involvement in the genesis of life, or the creation of life, or however you'd like to describe that. It's only 26% of the United States, people within the United States, according to the Pew Forum, and you can look at all their information online. Only 26% of people believe that life was directed solely through the process of natural selection. Now, I know that the immediate response to this is that, well, those 74% of people are idiots. And there's this post-Enlightenment idea that people that believe in evolution or move away from belief in a deity are therefore more intelligent. And I think that people that think this have not actually objectively looked at the statistics. I mean, you just do a Wikipedia search on religion and intelligence or belief in intelligence, and you find that there's a Lynn and two other research did a study, and what they found is that people who had intellectual capacities in the disability category have a much higher belief in God. So people that had infantile thought processes could comprehend the notion of God. They could not put faith in scientific means. And then what you find is when you move into IQs of 90 and above, you don't see that you have this curve of increasing. Looking to my left, you want to make sure I'm not making that up. You check the studies out. You want to the information is that once you get to an IQ of 90, which is that's lower average, you start to have an even skew, right? So you have an L like this, where it's people who have infantile or underdeveloped or what's known as intellectual disabilities do not believe in evolution. And then what you have is you have a plateau where the people within the 90 to 110 range have a varied level of belief in God or not. Now that's hardly a good sort of embodiment statistically of post-Enlightenment idea that religion is for smart people and only idiots disagree with this. So I think if you want to actually look at the statistical data, and first of all, I just want to make this abundantly clear. Between the IQ of 90 and an IQ of 110, okay, the mean IQ is 100. We're not talking genius or gifted. We're talking amongst people with average intelligence. You see an even distribution. I was not able to find statistics on people who are geniuses and above, okay? So this idea that the smarter you get, the less likely you are to believe in evolution, it's a fallacy, and it's not something that's supported by the data. I think what's happening here is people are confusing. People who have infantile perceptions are unable to assess and align with this idea of natural selection, and therefore they don't adhere to it. Now that could be cultural, that could be whatever. But saying that people that are intellectually disabled believe in God at a very high level is a very different thing than saying people with high intelligence abandon their faith. I hope you can see that. I hope you do some research on that of your own. So I just want to remove that. So the point that I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of people that are not sold on the idea that that natural selection is indeed this principle that governs biogenesis, the creation of all life. And at a glance, if I could describe orthodox evolutionary theory, I understand that there's a spectrum of definitions here, but if we can say that accumulation errors, right, so mutations at the genetic level, produce more complex beings, right, genetic beings, at a very fundamental level, am I less intelligent if I pose the question that says that, at a genetic level, do we find that mutations create anything, or do they degenerate something? Okay. I just want to say that a lot of what I'm about to talk about for the next 2 minutes is from a gentleman called Habermas. He wrote a book called Slaughter the Dissidents. So if you notice a lot of similarities, hat tip to Habermas. I'm taking just a lot of what he said. Now, I'm always been fascinated in the history of evolution. Or Darwinism, sorry. When I look at theories like Galileo and saying that Galileo Copernicus, who said that the sun was not the center of the universe, and also with Christopher Columbus and his journey around the world, the idea that the Earth was flat, and people will say to the church, well, the church was against these gentlemen. They said of these gentlemen, "You're eggs." Okay, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Remembering, of course, that in the West, the church was academia. The church was the academic establishment of the time. And they really heavily persecuted the ideas of a round Earth. Not necessarily true. The reason that they were against Columbus had more to do with the fact that they, unlike Columbus, they had correctly, I guess, hypothesized the circumference of the Earth, and they thought that anyone that tried to circumnavigate the globe would die because it's too large. So they weren't making an argument that said that people are going to go off the edge of the Earth. They were making the argument that said that, well, no, wait a second, the Earth is large. If you try and circumnavigate it, you're going to get lost in the sea. You're going to die, right? And we didn't know there was North America at the time. If there hadn't have been, that would have been a huge amount of water. And yeah, you probably would have died if you tried to circumnavigate the globe. And I think that argument has been changed to, well, no, the church said the Earth was flat. The church said the Earth was flat. Now, the reason they discouraged circumnavigation was because they probably had a better picture of the size of the planet Earth at that time. And again, this is an academic issue. It's not a biblical issue. It's not an issue of Christian faith. But what's more interesting is looking at the idea of a heliocentric galaxy. So the idea of the sun being at the center of the galaxy. And that's a beautiful biblical analogy. The idea that, man is not the center of the galaxy, right? Without the emanating warmth, without the provision and the, hydrogen reaction of the sun, we cease to exist. And that's a beautiful biblical metaphor. And it was something that was really destructive to, the Roman Catholic Church, I guess, at the time. And that was, that was an issue. And there was a huge amount of upheaval because of that scientific discovery. So it was one man that said, okay, here's my scientific data, here's my scientific idea, and then ensued a whole bunch of, recant or we kill you, right? Now, let's look at Darwinism on the other hand. You have, what I will hypothesize and put forward is you have a culture that was ripe for this idea, okay? When you have the discovery of someone like Einstein and relativity, he came up with an idea that immediately revolutionized physics at the time. And people adopted it because of the absolute brilliance of the science, the absolute succinctness of what he was proposing, and the variances and the shifts that he proposed to Newtonian mechanics. It was phenomenal, and we appreciated it as such. However, when we look at somebody like Darwin, we don't see the same sort of singular genius that we see amongst these other scientists, where one person makes a discovery and it has ripples across the entire breadth of science, although that's the way it's often put across as us. Darwin's grandpa wrote a book called Zoonomus in 1794, and this used almost every single topic and every single example that Erasmus used in 1794, Darwin later used in 1859 in his first edition of On Origin of the Species. Dr. James Hutton came up with a theory of selection in 1794. William Wells had a very similar idea in his book in 1813. Patrick Matthew in 1831 wrote a book called On Naval Timber and Arboriculture and had a brief mention of natural selection or a similar theory in his appendix. And most notably, Edward Blythe wrote articles, scientific articles that we know that Darwin had an opportunity to read from 1835 to 1837. So much so that there was a modern critic of the works of Darwin who said that this is, the amount of copying of Blythe's work is amount to academic plagiarism, and it's really poor science. Samuel Butler in 1879 made the exact, now his bias was obviously Christian, but he made the exact same accusation that Darwin plagiarized Buffon, Lamarck, and Erasmus, his grandfather. Now, what's really interesting is when Darwin, published his work, it was published, the 300 of the first 1,500 copies went directly to libraries, and libraries have a bit of a different function in 1859 than they do today. They're kind of like the Blockbusters or the, Netflix, where you get your, entertainment, enjoyment, intellectual stimulation from libraries, and you paid for a fee. It was for more affluent customers, etc., etc. And this idea was a popular idea. It was an idea that was, that was basically imbibed by the culture at the time. And I think this is quite evident by the fact that when Darwin died, some 30 years after the publication of On the Origin of Species, a theory that basically puts God out of work, that says that the reason that we believe in God is He's creator. And Darwin says we don't need a creator. We don't have a creator. It's just this, biogenesis through, not accumulation of mutations, because that's not what he believed at the time, but through natural selection. And yet the church that offended the most in England was fine with that. And 30 years later, they adopted it. And I think that when you have an idea that is, with a heliocentric galaxy that is so completely foundationally in objection to the current consensus, right? That it just puts shifts and schisms in culture as a whole. And I think you have that happening with Einstein. You have that happening with other revolutionary scientists who came up with ideas that rocked not only science, but also the culture as a whole. And I think what I see from looking at Darwin's work is a lot of the people that developed the idea prior to him were responding to cultural impetuses. Erasmus Darwin, when he developed the idea of all life originating from seashells, a lot of that was part of a personal diatribe that he had against culture at the time. And I would challenge anyone to do some research on Erasmus, and I hope I'm not saying that pejoratively and that you can back that up. But the point that I'm trying to make is that good science, I feel, will exist on sound research and move into shaking the culture. And I think what happened with Darwin is the culture was pre-shook, right? These post-Enlightenment ideas of, the church is it's an anachronism, and, the only opposition that occurred to this idea at the time of Darwin's publication was from the church. Society as a whole had, it just really was unconcerned with this. The United States was fighting the Civil War at the time. They were concerned with Reconstruction after that. They really didn't enter the fight until the Scopes, monkey trial in, was it 1925? So, I mean, it remained off the cultural radar of the United States, and it was, readily accepted within the scientific community of Britain at the time. And we don't see the same sort of scientific backlashes that we see amongst, other theories that have been proposed, like when, like I said, with the heliocentricity, where it's like, wow, this is phenomenal. And I'm not saying that every theory that has, there's proposed is going to have a massive schism within the scientific community and society, but a theory that completely rewrites the consensus on one's understanding of religion, how one relates to what is essentially the authority, the moral authority in society, would have some impact. And I think when we look at Darwinism and see that that was completely devoid outside of the clergy at the time, I think it is plausible that we can make the argument that Darwinism was a theory that met a cultural need, not a scientific theory that changed the culture. Okay, I think a lot of the change that existed, or that we account to Darwinism, existed prior to Darwin producing his works, on the origin of species and whatnot. And I mean, again, Darwin's stated aim with his publisher Murray was to have his book available to, working class people. I mean, this was, the Tom Clancy of literature. I mean, this was, I don't mean to be pejorative, but I mean, this was something that was popularly available. It was designed to engage the popular mind. And shouldn't these discourses and discussions be made at a scientific level? I mean, if this work is so completely seminal, it deserves some sort of academic discourse before it's going direct to, popular consumption, if you will. And I guess, okay, that's all well and good, but that's hardly, I mean, these are not really epistemological claims. All I've done is show that there could be a bias for the work that Darwin did to say that, well, there's a culture that was in need of this idea, and therefore they adopted it, as opposed to there was good science, and then we adopted it. So was this good science? And I think that, if we look at the history of what Darwinism is, I don't think that, I mean, Blythe himself, who was, from what I understand, deserves a lot more credit for the theory of natural selection than Darwin gave him, or anyone does, quite frankly, who himself was a creationist. He didn't believe that natural selection was this creative process. He did not, but the mechanisms and the idea of natural selection, he felt, were this mechanism to cull and redefine existing species, right, as opposed to be the genesis of new genetic material. And that's something that's very different. So the person that came up with this idea had a very different outlook on the purpose of this theory, which sort of takes, I think, a bit of the wind out of Darwin's sails. And I think, well, let's look at the, when Darwin was proposing this idea of of natural selection, basically what we're talking about is the transmission of characteristics across generations, and then processes working on those generations to change that populations toward, a greater, more interesting, more viable population. So what we need to look at is, well, what's the transmission mechanism? Because that really is the science behind natural selection. Okay, the reason that Darwinism isn't just anthropology is because we pretend that there's some scientific merit to it. So, I mean, in Darwin's time, he proposed pangenesis, which is an idea closely related to Lamarckianism. The idea that through gemmules, what would happen is gemmules are basically floating cells or floating organisms within your body that basically transmit your characteristics to your seminal so that through your, how would you describe it, through the reproductive process, these gemmules are essentially taking your characteristics. So if you've developed muscles during your lifetime, these gemmules are therefore receiving that information and then passing it on. So we see a theory whose major framework we've completely thrown out the window. I mean, that's ludicrous. I mean, Lamarckianism is probably one of the most bizarre. I mean, we know that ever since Mendel that we cannot pass on. That's not the way that genes work. Okay, you don't pass on your, if you got a scar on your cheek, you don't have gemmules reading that and then passing that on to your progeny so that they also get a scar on the cheek. And I mean, that's crazy. Dare I say, it's almost epigenetics. But sorry. And then one of the other ideas was something that I don't think was that Huxley, who was one of the basically everyone's Darwin's major supporter. There was an idea that was popular at the time also was orthogenesis, which he didn't like, but it was considered part of the framework at that time amongst a certain amount of people of Darwinian natural selection. And orthogenesis is the idea that there's this mysterious inner force. So basically you have this direction within the cells, which is this, I mean, I hear the concept God of the gaps, but it's a biology of the gaps. So we have gemmules that are magically transporting things. We have orthogenesis, some sort of magic inner force that transports things. And we've completely thrown these out. So we don't have gemmules, we don't have pangenesis, we don't have orthogenesis, Lamarckianism is destroyed, so what do we have left? Mutations. Think about that. The genetic basis behind natural selection, right? And I'm not saying that natural selection doesn't occur. The fittest survive, okay? But where did the fittest come from? Mutations, right? This collection, this amalgam of beneficial mutations creating life. Now, mutations are almost, categorically destructive, right? And I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't, cases where you'll have a mutation where, let's say that you have a cell that, I'm trying to remember some of the works of Jonathan Sarfati. I was reading one of his books, which I thought was quite interesting. Who had the chance to meet, pretty cool guy. He looks very stressed out, but he's awesome. And one of the points that he put across was that, within biology, we have cells that will appear to gain functionality. So, for example, if you have a cell that, moderates between being able to, synthesize energy from carbon dioxide and one that's able to synthesize energy through water. Sorry, I'm not a biochemist, so I apologize for the analogy. But and it will only synthesize carbon dioxide after it's it's exhausted the supply of water, of H2O. And in so doing, what they find is that that organisms that lose that ability, so basically they're able to synthesize both materials all the time, have higher rates of growth, and therefore they're more advanced, etc., etc. But what we find is in these cases, these are mechanisms that are falling apart, that have apparent, population consequences that we could say, well, yeah, this population is more fit, but it's through a deteriorational process. And we'll find that, across the board. I don't want to get into that too much. I think it's something you need to look at, but I think that basically the bottom line is, can we have mutations that, through their accumulation, right? So is the general trend of mutations to produce positive effect, or is it to deteriorate positive effect? And I'm not saying there aren't cases where populations will actually have an increased survivability because of mutations, but at the genetic level, those mutations are often destructive. So functionality or directionality or moderation within the cell is being lost and producing apparent positive consequences. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. So the point is that that's the framework. I mean, God's out of a job, and we have. I mean, I'd love to talk about things like, well, let's look at the fossil record. I mean, I love people saying, well, we're looking for gaps in the fossil record, and I think that the fossil record is there. I mean, anyone that watches this video, if you and I, if we got together and went to any museum, local museum, we could spend the next 100 years cataloging fossils. You can buy fossils on TradeMe or eBay for 50 cents and $1. We don't have any shortage of fossils. What we do is we have shortage of information within those records. And I'm not talking about gaps, and I'm not talking, boggles my mind these bizarre selection criteria that Dawkins presents, where we have populations, and the reason we see these gaps is because one population calls the other population because it's migration patterns are over top of the other population, and therefore we don't. And it's okay, fine, but it's all a bit circumspect. From a personal point of view, but I think that the point that in watching a video by Gary Habermas is the point that he pointed out is you look at a number of species within the fossil record, like turtles, fish. I'm reading off a list here: dinosaurs, flowers, plants, and vertebrates, bats, frogs, marsupials, duck-billed platypus, favorite amongst Darwin deniers or Darwin supporters, kiwis, important to New Zealanders. They appear and then they disappear, or none of these. Well, it's dinosaurs. They appear and they disappear. We don't see anything prior to it, and we're not in any need or want of fossils. We got heaps of fossils. We're not finding them. And we have a theory where it began, 1859, so 150 years ago, and the frameworks that existed at that time have all been ripped out. Pangenesis, orthogenesis, Lamarckism, Gemmules, and we've now replaced it with mutations. So the framework itself has failed. We have a new one, right? We don't see a huge amount of these transitions, but, we can come up with clever arguments like, well, a gap is really just, we're talking about, continuous, and we're looking at finite, discrete instances, so of course we're going to have gaps, et cetera, and we're really just blurring the lines between, well, we don't have that evidence. We don't have these, it's just not that convincing, and the other thing is the thing that is as an engineer, I'm not a scientist, the thing that I look at when I look at biology, and specifically around this issue, is I see that this is an issue that is cultural. It's like 64% of people have an issue on it, and they have no problem with creationism. People have opinions on this. There was another study, I think it was the Pew Forum, that said that 40% of people think that the origins is an absolutely crucial, pivotal, important element to religion, right, to our existence. And so when I'm looking at this as someone who needs to make a decision on, looking at the evidence here, what I'm seeing is I'm seeing a culture that was ready for this idea, right? A culture that was hungry for this idea, that had divorced itself and really wanted to, dare I say it, remove a creator. And this was a brilliant way to do it. And then, since then, it stumbled across, a number of mechanisms to try and explain this: the Gemmules, the Pangenesis, the Orthogenesis, the Lamarckianism, mutations. You have other cultures like the United States that really misses out on the discourse over this issue, and then begins to fight over it in the 1925s because they see, well, no, wait a second, there is cultural issues here, and then continues to lose that in legal fights from 1925 until now, where we see that what ends up happening is that people that argue for this issue are marginalized. You can't argue for this issue. The Lemon Test says that, which is sort of the legal framework that judges whether you can teach something that has religious connotations in a classroom, says that if what you are supporting entangles the state with religion, or has a bias towards religion, so basically promotes religion, you can't do it, right? So what you end up happening is you have people that are dissenting against Darwinism, and they're being classified as religious, right? Now, sure, it would be advantageous to Christianity if we could, teach openly and prove that evolution was off the books, right? And just categorically remove it from discourse and discussion. Well, I don't think discourse and discussion, but if we could settle this once and for all, I think that'd be to everyone's advantage type of thing, right? But the scary thing is that the Moore versus Gaston Board of Education in 1973 case ruled that students have a right to hear all points of view. So, and then in this case, what happens is you can speak against biblical creationism, but the Lemon test, what will happen is it has been consistently employed to say that someone that speaks not for creationism, but against Darwinism is indeed a creationist, right? Now that's a scary thing. There is no legal dissent within the United States on this issue, because any dissent is religious. Now that's an assumption, and there was when this issue went to the Supreme Court, there was a Supreme Court judge that said that, wait a second, we are making inferences on the motives of the people that are enacting legislation and regarding education. The case had to deal with some sort of trying to eliminate some sort of bias towards Darwinism or against creation. I don't know, I can't remember. But the idea was that we can't make these assumptions. But the Lemon test within the United States says that if you talk against Darwinism, you're out. And there's a number of cases. There's Dan Scott was a professor who was fired not because he taught evolution, not because he taught creationism, but because he wasn't enthusiastic about Darwinism. He didn't even speak against Darwinism. He was not enthusiastic about it. Guillermo Gonzalez wrote a book called The Universe's Purpose. He's not Christian. He just basically, as you know, no one knows what his religion is or what his beliefs are. He was kicked out of Iowa State simply for stating that there is some purpose to, the universe. Roger DeHart was forbidden from using articles from Science and Nature. Serious? Because of their implications in critiquing Darwinism. There was also another book. There's a book by Jerry Fedor and Massimo Patelli-Palamarini, and they wrote a book as atheists and made it quite clear that, listen, we are atheists. We have no religious affiliation, but we absolutely disagree with the idea that natural selection can be responsible for biogenesis. The name of the book was What Darwin Got Wrong, and it's just these guys have gone through heck to do it. I remember there was again from reading Gary Habermas, he points out that there was a creationist who got a PhD. His name was Marcus Ross. New York Times did a full page above the fold ad about how dare they. Well, I mean, this was the response. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. That's what the New York Times was saying. But they made an above the fold front page article on a gentleman who got his PhD as an out of the closet creationist, and that was offensive. And I guess the thing that I'm going to close it right here, but the point that I'm trying to make is that the reason this is bad science is because this idea came into a culture that wanted it, right? Now, within academic studies, it is important to reveal your bias. Some people have written, academic articles stating that, well, hey, maybe we need to make our biases more prevalent within our research. And I guess the proposition that I'm making is that with a huge amount of prior art before Darwin, with Darwin putting this information directly to the public and playing off public sentiment, and from that point of view making this a scientific revelation, to the academic community, it's problem before scientific theory. It's culture, and let's find the science that matches it. And I think that Darwin's England of 1859 needed Darwinism. It needed a theory that, post-Enlightenment, got rid of God. And I got that. I got that in Darwin. Why wasn't Blythe, why don't we read about Blythe's theories? He had essentially the same thing, but he didn't draw the conclusions that said that the origin of all life was a result of natural selection. He thought it was a culling. So he looks at the exact same mechanisms in biology, makes the exact same biological inferences, but because he's unwilling to go from natural selection to biogenesis, all we hear about is Darwinism. And that's not science, That's culture looking for a rationalization of its beliefs. And we see that today because of the fact that we have a culture that is really divided in the public sphere over what is right and what is true and what is not. And we don't allow any dissent to this. And the reason that I'm not interested in looking at Darwinism is because I haven't found anyone who supports Darwinism who's open to a discourse or a debate on it. And I haven't found too many people in Darwinism who have the outlook that says that, you know what, I could be wrong on this. And it's sort of like it's arguments from authority. As a Darwinist, I know everything. This is the answer. Bada boom, bada bing. And I think that there's really the bias that informs this theory historically should give pause. I think the amount of science, the scientific framework that has been thrown away during the development of this theory is important to understand. And I think the current climate, you know what, I mean, a scientific establishment that has close to trillions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, in academic grants and funding and research versus a so-called creation science, ideology that has maybe tens of millions of dollars a year, it's not going to compete. And I think that one of the scariest things is to have a massive, hugely entrenched ideology that can't be challenged. It's not science. Okay, it's rhetoric. And people need to realize that, and people need to. You can prove me wrong on everything, but in my last 4 years at the University of Auckland, it's rare that I meet somebody who is interested in discussing the implications of this theory, the possible fallacies or shortcomings of this, and I'm an opponent of it. So yes, I'm making those objections, and I know people who have lost job prospects because of their stance on this. It's just it's bizarre, and my severe hope is that the people that really engage the biological evolutionary question really just look at it. I mean, and I've had some very interesting biological discussions about tRNA cells and the idea that pluripotent cells can be transferred across through embryos, and predators will eat those and then they'll therefore transfer disease markers. And I personally thought it was ludicrous, but the biology I think is fascinating. I think when we look at it, there are some oppositional viewpoints, and I think that the biggest mistake that biology students at the University of Auckland make is they fail to recognize that there is a reasoned opposition out there, and they can get really. Well, I don't want to make any inferences here, but I think that for their sake, what they need to do is this is an issue that has a huge amount of ramifications ideologically, and regardless, when you approach this material, you need to do so understanding that there is an opposition. It's not unreasoned. I think that anytime you look at an opponent and say that they don't know anything, you're in a situation where you yourself are not a qualified opponent, or you're not really part of any discourse or discussion, or whatever the case may be. So challenge the opposition. I mean, again, I don't. Yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to say. I want to see a biologist from the University of Auckland who understands the opposition to Darwinism before they open their mouth about why it's the greatest theory on the face of the planet. Because I know very few people that can name one cogent argument against Darwinism while being an adamant and fundamentalist supporter of that ideology. So I'll leave it at that. That was much longer than I wanted to. But thank you for your patience. I hope you enjoyed that, and I look forward to rebuttals. Thank you very much. Bye.